Peace and prosperity, family. This is M9NDTV, where we provoke thoughts and inspire thinking. I'm your host, the Hut 9. Today we have a very special treat for you. We're gonna be rebroadcasting an interview with one of our master teachers and master scholars, Asa G. Hillard, who will be talking about returning to the source, the African origins of things. So we're gonna get right into this interview, and I hope you guys appreciate it. And if you do, please remember to subscribe, share the information with your social media networks. Make sure you leave a comment, and again, please subscribe.
Hello, I'm Lister Velt Middleton. We are very glad to have you with us. At the beginning of this century, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois predicted that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And color, the glorification of one and denigration of another or others, continues to play a dominant role in determining how power is distributed. But what are the tools that have been used and are being used to maintain black-white power relationships? And how are words and images being used to control thought and action among people of African descent in the United States and around the globe? When and how does an African become a Negro? How was the myth of white superiority created in the modern world, and how was it projected back in time? So-called Western education for black children, poison or medicine, the origins of humanity, the beginnings of civilization, royal African images in ancient Egypt, and Africa's gift to Europe. Just some of the topics we'll explore with Dr. Asa G. Hillard III, the Fuller E. Calloway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University. Dr. Hillard is the former Dean of the School of Education at San Francisco State University. A highly respected educational psychologist, Dr. Hillard was involved with the court case that outlawed IQ testing for black children in California. Dr. Hillard recovered with Julian Richardson, George G.M. James' seminal work, Stolen Legacy, the African Origin of Greek Philosophy. Dr. Hillard, what does it mean to be black in America from a psycho-historical perspective?
It's important for blacks in America to know history. That history includes the history of enslavement in Africa, of colonization, later of segregation in the United States. My own studies as a psychologist of the uses of history have shown that this enslavement had more than one part to it. There was a physical enslavement, but the only way that physical enslavement would work is that the mind also had to be enslaved. And there were a series of processes that I call the dynamics of domination. These processes go something like this, that in order for one group of people, in this case Europeans, to control an African population, it was necessary first to erase African memory. Secondly, to suppress the practice of African culture. Third, to teach white supremacy. Fourth, to control the institution of socialization, to prevent African people from educating their own children, from sending their own messages and so forth through media and what have you. The control of wealth, and finally, physical segregation. These are the historical activities that Europeans engaged in order to conquer the continent, to enslave people, to practice segregation. And of course, if you look closely at that list, you'll notice that the first few things on the list are really psychological. For example, to destroy memory or to suppress or erase memory is a psychological operation which disables anyone as an individual who had no memory.
Now, when you say memory, you're talking about personal memory or what?
I mean the memory of one's group history in particular. Personal memory would be important if we're talking about your own psychological individual adaptation. But you can use the same thinking to apply to a group. When a group loses its historical memory, it is disabled as a result. So these were some of the very calculated and conscious tactics that were applied that resulted in the disabling of the African population. So history, identity, the teaching a belief in white supremacy, each of these is a psychological process that was practiced, and we need to understand that in part by going back and examining the historical record. And having understood it, it's possible to gain control over those things that control us.
What do you mean by de-Africanization, and how did that process work?
Well, of course, that leads right out of what we were just talking about, that the erasing of memory, the teaching of white supremacy, and so forth, can place an African population in a position where it begins to reject its own image of itself, its own memory of itself, its own history, becomes less African in conscious behavior, although it's very hard to become, if you're truly of African origin, it's very hard for that behavior to disappear. But it's easier for the consciousness of that behavior to disappear. And so over a period of time, figure the centuries that African populations have been in America, it's possible that the population merely American, each of these is a step or an indication that there is some loss of conscious contact with one's true identity.
You have talked about the neuroses, I guess that's the word maybe, among the European population during this enslaving period. Would you address that, please?
Right. Well, if you operate a system of domination, a formal system of domination, by those rules that I talk about, you have to confront the truth. And the only way that you can be consistent in applying those rules is ultimately to bend the truth. And after a while, it results in an adaptive process that we call racism, which is really a mental disorder. It's a disorder in the mental sense because it follows the rules of mental disorder. For example, manifestations of racist behavior as a result of domination are the denial of reality, perceptual distortion, delusions of grandeur, phobias in the face of differences, and projecting blame, blaming the victim.
Explain those, please.
Well, each of these are ways that I guess you call them adjustment or adaptive mechanisms. For example, if you take Africa as it really existed, and you attempt to subjugate Africa as Europeans did, it couldn't work if you're subjugating another human being. So that human being had to be changed mentally into something else. It had to be changed into a subhuman or an animal or anything else. But you could not operate and be consistent with yourself. So it required a change in one's mind, which meant that the Europeans had to begin to lie to themselves about what Africa was and had been. And in the process of keeping that misinformation going, then one adapts to unreality. So when you see reality, it's necessary to deny reality. So denial of reality would be an example of that, would be to look at the population of Egypt, which was a black population, and to say it was a white population. That's a flat-out denial of what the facts say, and that, of course, has been typical throughout history. Perceptual distortion is just simply not getting a clear view of what is really true, even while looking at the truth. Teaching of white supremacy means the belief in the supremacy of white people, or it could be anyone who would follow the rules of oppression. If one decided that their own group was superior to all other groups, that would be an example of what I call a Napoleonic complex, because it is not true that the white group is superior to anyone else, but the belief in that would be a psychological distortion of reality, and in that sense would be following the rules for oppression.
Okay, as we get ready to go to the first slide, you said that racism is a mental disorder.
Yes.
I was interviewing a gentleman the other day, and I brought that up in a conversation, and he said, well, racism is not a mental disorder. He said racism is very ordered. He said that whites, Europeans, know exactly what they're doing, that racism is a political and economic convenience. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking about. If you talk about I think of systems as having designers, as having advocates, as having players, and as having pawns. This is from game theory, and I borrowed that from Bob Williams, who analyzes systems in that way. Everybody is not a game maker or a game designer. So the game designer might be conscious of creating a racist system, whereas the advocate probably becomes unconscious. They buy into the system that was created by the designer. And so the advocate is a racist in the sense that I'm talking about it, or the dealer, those people who carry out the rules of the master in the system without really knowing why the master created the system or even that a system was created. They just simply inherit a belief system and an action system. And in that sense, they are players in the game, but they are not the game makers. So I make a distinction.
Now break that down for the person on the street one time.
Right.
Go over that again.
There are some people who are puppets.
All right.
And there are others who are puppeteers.
Thank you. Free your mind.
I'll try to do a better job.
Okay. Free your mind. Return to the source. African origins. Why that title?
Okay. Well, obviously we've been talking about the fact that the adjustment to domination is kind of a mental adjustment as well as a physical adjustment. So for the person who is enslaved and for the person who enslaves, I've already suggested that there is a distortion between the real world and what they believe. There's a mismatch between those two things. So what we need to do in order to get back at the truth is to have mental freedom. So I like to title this a program about mental freedom. So it's free your mind. Return to the source suggests the way to get to mental freedom. That means going back to primary sources. Instead of talking about what someone heard, let's go to the evidence itself. Also in the case of African people, it means returning to African sources because that's the only way that renewal can occur. And then, of course, African origins refers to the fact that Africa is the home of many things, and most of us don't know that. And it's been things have been said about Africa that make us believe the opposite of that. We don't believe that Africa was a creative place, that it was a teacher. We believe that Africa was always a recipient, a student of other people. And so African origins, which is the source, one of the sources, by considering those African origins, it's a way to free the mind of oppressor and oppressed. I have a short section that I call the defamation of African people. And the reason that I do this is that it's important to establish the fact that some of the things I said are true. And we won't have time to go into many of these, but I'll just show you an example of the perceptual distortion, the denial of reality, the attempt to erase history, the attempt to oppress culture. All right. In 1910, the Encyclopedia Britannica had an article in it about Negro. This would be one of many examples of how African and other people get information about themselves. And here's an example. I actually took a photograph of that article. And if you'll notice in the second underlined paragraph on that article, it says, mentally, the Negro is inferior to the white. Then it goes on in that article to talk about the fact that as children, our children were okay, they were bright, smart, well-developed, but that as black children and white children grow older, black children become dumb and white children become smart. And therefore, you have to think of black and white people as being different people. This is in the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is in the most respected encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Britannica. So the most authoritative thought then would have sanctioned this view in 1910. And that was not unlike what was being said in theological schools, which were teaching that Africans did not have souls, that would be taught in certain biology classes, which were teaching that Africans were not even a part of the same branch of the human family, that would have been taught in history classes, which taught that Africans had no history, and so forth and so on. In other words, that whole body of thought that emerged during the periods of the past couple hundred years to create the orientation among Europeans that would allow them to oppress African people without feeling bad about it.
So what does this say about the role white scholarship played and continues to play in the oppression of black people?
In general, European scholarship has been leading in the creation of the belief system. In fact, I think it would be safe to say that without the scholars, there would have been no racism, because they helped create the belief system with authenticity. If a professor of biology says that Africans are inferior, there would have been no racism, because they helped create the belief system with authenticity. If a professor of biology says that Africans are inferior, if a professor of theology says it, it's different than having a man on the street say it. So we can actually, in tracing the history of racism, in other words, we don't have to speculate about this, there are many good books on the history of racism led by scholars in academic institutions. A good example would be the book by Alan Chase called The Legacy of Malthus. And there are many others. The Leopard Spots by Stanton. There are many books that study the seminal role that scholars have played in creating these images of Africans.
Once again, why did the slave master attempt to de-Africanize the African?
Well, it's very important. Anyone who studies the function of culture, what culture does for a group of people, knows that culture glues a group of people together so that you have group unity. So that for the slave master to be successful, he had to destroy group unity. And the best way that he could destroy group unity was to destroy that which held the group together, which was the group's own identity, way of life, historical memory, or, in short, to destroy the group's culture.
Why should a people 400 years physically removed from Africa be concerned about their Africanness?
For the same reason that I was trying to explain in terms of why the slave master chose to attack the culture of the slave. If the slave is to be liberated, the slave must affirm that culture, must go back, recapture, incorporate, use their own native cultural forms as the base for creating a brand new life.
Well, you know what, Malcolm X, he quoted somebody one time saying, you know, I didn't leave anything in Africa. You know, I'm not an African.
That's true.
You know?
Yeah, he said, you say I haven't left anything in Africa. Mm-hmm. He says, why, you left your mind in Africa, which is true.
Okay.
Okay, let's take a look then at the next example. Would be a page out of a catalog called Johnson Catalog, where white actors, minstrels could get something that was called nigger makeup. And this was circulated all over the country, and for years, actually for almost 50 years, one of the most popular forms in entertainment in America was this minstrel. So here is a white actor, in this case Al Jolson, and we need to see the whole slide.
Okay.
Al Jolson, who became very famous doing imitations of imitation black people, because these were not real black people. But you'll notice that he has burnt cork on his face, and he's done something to his hair, and then he becomes comic, and that gives him the opportunity to project an image of African people to other people. And so this is another example of the defamation of African people. Here's a contemporary example. This is Darky toothpaste that's sold by Colgate Palmolive Company. It's sold in the Far East. And again, the the exaggeration of black facial features, the business of ridicule and so forth, making fun of black people. You see that happening right now. And in fact, there's an article in the Atlanta Constitution showing the reaction of some groups to the fact that Colgate-Palmolive Company sold this stuff in the Far East. When they were asked about it, according to this news article, they said...
What year?
This would have been, I think, it's 1986, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
They said, when asked about this, well, there's no black people over here anyway to see this, and it's not offensive to others, so we're going to go ahead and sell it. So the last word I had is still being sold.
James Baldwin has said that many times what you say about someone else says more about you than about that person. With this in mind, what was the commentary that whites were making about themselves when they blackened their faces?
Well, you know, there's a real interesting book called Blacking Up. And it really examines the psychology of white people who blacked up. Blacking up means putting on the burnt cork and doing minstrels. At one level, you could say it's creating entertainment and making fun of black people. But what this book talks about from first-hand interviews with people who used to do that was they actually had an identification with the black culture, sometimes with black people. And one person said they just didn't feel right until they got blacked up. They'd lay down at night and dream about blacking up. They'd have this in their dreams for days and days on end, and until they could actually get blacked up and begin to do the things that they thought black people did.
Oh, no. Are there strong Freudian implications for this, or what?
If I were a Freudian psychologist, I'd give you a Freudian explanation for it. But clearly it's something that needs to be studied as a behavioral phenomenon. You know, the idea of the psychological meaning that this has for whites, other than just simply making fun of black people. Some people treat it as just being mean, but there's much more to it than that. Okay, let's, here's another example. There are a few more. I'll just run through these because our interest is in some other things, but this is an example of postcards that used to be sent through the United States Mail. I have hundreds of these. This says, "A coon trees a possum in Dixie." So it's making fun of the black male. Sapolio. This is the use of the watermelon as a stereotype with black face in it. And this was an advertisement for soap.
And this is happening around what period?
Well, it happened up, and it's still happening, quite frankly, but you'd see most of these in the 20s, 30s, 40s, in the 50s, and even into the 60s. You'd see a lot of advertisements like these. Even now, you still see sold in stores the little man who holds the lantern outside for your lawn, you know, a black figure who holds the lantern as a servant. This was a textbook that was used in the late 1800s. 10 Little Niggers, actually used in schools as a textbook.
In this country?
In this country, yes. It would be interesting to go through the pages of this textbook and see the stories, because they're even more objectionable than the title suggests, but we just don't have time to get into it. But again, if African American children have to rely on these images for understanding about who they are and where they have come from, then you can see that we are putting into the African American mind information that will distort reality.
So all of these images were designed to do what?
To defame black people, to, as you say, de-Africanize black people, to turn the African into something other than an African.
Okay.
For the purposes that we talked about a little earlier, to destroy the cultural base in order to destroy the political unity of the group.
Okay.
Okay, the question was asked in a magazine article some time ago, the television, because now we want, you know, you were asking earlier, how long ago was this? And I indicated that these things continue to happen even in 1987. Does television have a secret formula for blacks? And we see the Jeffersons as one of the most popular programs on TV. And this is the picture that talks about what that formula is. It appears that on American television, virtually all of the programming that is done about black people is programming that is written by white people. You know, there are very few exceptions to this. And these are some of the authors of those programs, like the Jeffersons, like Fred Sanford and Son, and so forth. So what we have in black images on television is white people's images of what black people are or perhaps ought to be.
Which is a continuation of the minstrels.
Which is a continuation of the minstrel. And so we'll see it. Let's see what kind of images they like. They like images like this, Fred Sanford, like this, J.J. You remember how prominent J.J. was?
I think he's back on television again.
Is he back on?
He's back on. He has a family now, I think.
He has okay. But he's doing the same things in all probability. Let's look at what happens as a consequence of that over time. Then African-American children, looking at the negative images of African people that are shown, cannot develop positive images of themselves. So then they seek images that are positive by looking at other people besides themselves.
Okay.
Okay, that was just a brief introduction. We could have done hours just on that part alone. And there's really a need to go into that kind of thing much more in detail.
But this is the part that you want to get to.
This is the part that I want to get to.
Okay. Okay.
But my wife told me that I had to put that other part in, or people wouldn't know why it was necessary for me to go into this part. Okay. The next section is a section that we call Africa as the Cradle of Humanity. And there's a need to talk about this because until recently there's been very little acknowledgement of the fact that the human family was a single human family. You know, a few years ago, 100 years or so ago, there were many theories about the fact that that human beings actually started separately in different places on the earth. That black people started in Africa, white people started in Europe, yellow people started in Asia.
Polycentric,
polygenetic theory, many origins for human beings. Well, I think that's been pretty thoroughly discredited now, and as they began to search for what was called a monogenetic origin, or a single origin for all people, that there's really only one human family, and that's what I think almost everybody believes right now, that as they began to search for this one source of the human family, the chauvinism of the people who were doing the searching at the time, those who were searching were European. So they wanted this human family to originate in Europe, or they wanted its fullest development to be European. So they began to search in Europe for ancient fossil finds, ancient bones. Never really were able to go back very far. In fact, as far as they were ever able to go back was about 500,000 years. Then the search for this human ancestor shifted to Asia, and it was very intensive. The search could only go back to about 1 million years, and then this search shifted to Africa. They were looking in all these places at the same time, but they really wanted to find the oldest bones in Europe, and if not Europe, then Asia, and finally in Africa. And of course, Africa is now recognized by virtually everyone as the home of the human family. And it starts back about 5 million years ago. And Africa is not only the home of all the human types. There are 6 different human types that have been on the earth, and Africa is the home of all 6 of those types, and the earliest form of each of those types is found on the continent of Africa.
But once again, why were European scholars so bent on making Europe the place of origin of humanity?
They would be what you call Eurocentric. In other words, they wanted to elevate Europe, to claim all good things for Europe, and at that time the origin of man being in Europe could have been considered support for the theory of white supremacy or European supremacy.
Now, what time are we talking? What time period are we talking about?
We're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. during that period, but especially during the last 200 years. Okay, the National Geographic magazine is, I guess in 1985, November of 1985, that's when this particular issue was presented, contains the summary of the information that I was just giving you, and I will go through it very quickly. Today, Africa is recognized as the cradle of the human race. That's one line out of that article on early man in National Geographic. Skin color was probably dark, an evolutionary adaptation to the tropical sun.
Why is that?
Why was skin color dark? Well, biologists have a rule, an explanation that says that warm-blooded animals, like human beings, when they live in tropical climates, in humid tropical climates, develop pigmentation. They have a chemical called eumelanin, which is responsible, among other things, for skin color. And that dark skin color in the tropics protects you from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. So anyone who was not protected in that way generally wouldn't survive. For example, albinos can survive to a normal life in northern Europe. A normal life, there's really very little threat to their lives. But in the tropics, very few live beyond the age of 30. So because of the ultraviolet rays of the sun being damaging to people with that pigmentation. And until we had air conditioning and other forms of adjustment, it wasn't easy for populations not native to Africa to survive in Africa. But so that if you were guessing what the early African looked like, as people who study that do now, the archaeologists, paleontologists, biologists who are interested in ancient human beings, their best guess is that these ancient human beings had to be black people, just as the people of Africa today are.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, here is one of the human types. Remember I said there were 6 human types. There were 2 different types of Australopithecines, Australopithecus gracile, Australopithecus robustus, Homo habilis. And these 3 types that I've shown so far are found only on the continent of Africa. Nowhere else do they exist. Then we have the first one to leave the continent of Africa was Homo erectus, the one that I'm showing you now. Homo erectus left the continent of Africa approximately 1 million years ago. And we call this one Pithecanthropus erectus, if you've heard heard him talked about in school. Then there is Neanderthal. This one apparently left the continent of Africa somewhere around 500,000 years ago. But the oldest bones for Neanderthal are found on the African continent. This one is called Homo sapiens sapiens. This is the only one that's left out of the 6, and that's modern man. And so
who
also originated in Africa. Now there's some new information on modern man. For years, the best estimate as to how old modern man was in Africa was that modern man was approximately 100,000 years old in Africa. It turns out now that there are some people who are doing studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is genetic information in the human cell. And it turns out that there's 2 different types of DNA information generators. One is in the middle of the cell, or the nucleus of the cell. The other is in the tissue of the cell. That DNA that's in the tissue of the cell is carried only by the female. That allows scientists to study the evolution of different groups. And without going into all the technical details, which I don't understand, and it is necessary at this point, it is important to point out that in 3 different parts of the world, in London, I think it was at Oxford, at Emory University in Georgia, Atlanta, at Berkeley, California, at these 3 universities, independently, these scientists have studied through computer modeling, backwards in time, the origin of the human family. And they come up with a woman they call African Eve. And instead of 100,000 years old, this woman is 250,000 years old. That's the estimate. And it turns out that in their theory, one African woman is responsible, or at least is the direct ancestor of every human being on the face of the earth. Everybody who now lives traces their ancestry back to this one African woman. And the speculation about how she looked is that she would look like a person that we call the Australian bush people. I mean, the South African Bushmen in the Kalahari region, not the Australian, but in southern Africa, in the Kalahari region, you have the so-called bush people, and that these people have the genetic material that is diversified enough to have been the unit that became the parent group for everybody else in the world.
So once again, this woman would have been how old then?
250,000 years old. Now,
least.
just by way of comparison, the oldest Homo sapiens sapiens bones that we find in Europe are 50,000, about 40,000 to 50,000 years old. This is the Grimaldi skeletons that were found in the Grimaldi cave.
So you have the African, how long ago now?
You have the African at least 200,000 years before they moved to the European continent.
And the European comes on the scene when?
Well, the African comes on the scene in Europe approximately 50,000 years ago. In other words, the first European was an African too, and is still an African. He's just an African who has changed.
And once again, what happened to that African once he got to Europe?
Well, you had several ice ages and a change in environment, and the theory is that the change in environment, and especially the ice age part of it, being cut off from the African continent, having a completely different environment with respect to diet and climate and all those things, resulted over a 20,000 year period in physical changes, genetic mutations to adapt to that particular environment. And about 20,000 years or so ago, we have changes sufficient that we look and see distinct people when they really aren't distinct in that sense, in the sense of having groups that can't interbreed. That's what one of the biological definitions of race is, that groups can't, a dog and a cow can't have offspring, so they would be different strains, but varieties of the same family, so that the European that resulted was merely a depigmented African.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay, if you notice, all these fossils that I was talking about, and this is just a sample of some of them, are located in Africa, mainly in the same place. They all are located with their center around Lake Victoria or Lake Nyanza. And so you'll see that they're in Ethiopia, they're in Tanzania, they're in Uganda, down in Mozambique, and so forth. These are the places, but mostly in Kenya and Tanzania. These are the richest fossil finds. But I'm trying to show that they're tightly packed together in one place, and that's all of the types are generally, you would say that they had their home in the equatorial region of Africa. And then later, they moved northward down the Nile Valley. Remember, the Nile is about 4,000 miles long. And so that was literally a highway down which these populations over various times migrated. At least 3 of them migrated far enough to leave the African continent.
Okay.
Okay, so far what we've talked about is the defamation of African people and examples of that. Then we've talked about the origin of the human family, which brings us to really what is the most important part, because early man, early man and modern man being found in Africa by itself has very little meaning for most of the things that we're concerned about, which has to do with what some people call civilized behavior. So what we want to know, though, is when did human beings begin to develop high civilization, and who were these human beings that did that? It turns out that Africans were, according to the records that we have now, the ones who first developed the elements of high civilization. And that's what we'd like to look at right now, which is the story of high civilization in the world, which is also the beginning of civilization on the African continent.
Okay.